Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
They've been able to decorate their room the way they want. If they want to go out and party for a night, they don't have to account to anybody. And now suddenly they're back in a home environment where the mother says, well, where are you going tonight? And how long are you going to be out? And when are you going to get back? And so on.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Norman Gadan, who is head of the Counseling Center at the University of Toledo. Father Bacik and Mr. Gadan will discuss college and the family, dealing with the home life. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Norm, I actually run this show as an opportunity for recent authors to push their books. And that's why I've really invited you on this program. You have been remarkably productive lately. And I'd like to talk about one of your books, really, and I can't think of the title of it. Would you help me?
Could it be the one about parents, Jim?
That's the one.
Okay, it's called Parenting Through the College Years. And
Parenting Through the College Years. And I know you wrote that along with somebody else.
With Sally Valongo, who's a feature writer and Sunday supplement writer for the Toledo Blade. She and I teamed up.
And a very fine writer, I must say.
Yes, she is. That's why the book reads so well. She's an excellent writer. And she's also a student of college and the college experience, and has a daughter in college. And this fall we'll have 2 kids in college, so I'm kind of personally interested in it too.
Well, one of the reasons that I asked you on the program was not just to mention your book, but to talk about the substance of the book and the material, which I find fascinating. I heard you talk about it once before and was very interested in that. And, of course, I spend a lot of my time and energy working with college students and now and then with their parents. And so I thought that that would be of general interest. So I would like to talk a bit about the relationship between parents and their offspring who go to college, the whole family situation involved in that. And I suppose one of the things that I note very often is the great difficulties that students have in leaving the family and coming to the campus and being in that new situation. And my guess is that that relates a lot to the way they have been trained at home, the kind of families that they come from, and so on. So why don't we try to focus a bit on that side of the multifaceted book that you have written, and deal with that family background and the leaving home and the coming to the campus and so on.
Fine. I think that's a good place to start, and I think the way you bring up the question also is very good. It's coming to college, I think, is seen more and more by those of us who work with students as a family event or part of a family process. We tend to usually think of the student coming, being alone, possibly homesick, upset, finding themselves anxious in a new environment, feeling a little bit out of place, knowing that they're probably going to get a little bit lower grades than they're used to, being maybe kind of a small fish in a big pond. Usually colleges are larger than high schools, the learning and the demands are different. And what we're coming to realize, particularly from our work with families in the summer orientation at the University of Toledo and other schools that do this, is that it's really a family event. Parents are often upset, feel very concerned, sometimes depressed, can have a whole lot of range of feelings, often very negative emotions.
That's right.
Which surprises them.
Yeah.
They come away feeling like, what's wrong with me? Why am I depressed because my son or my daughter is going to college?
And they have a lot of fears, don't they, about that new environment. And
exactly.
I think one of the factors is the question of whether the parents went to college themselves or not. Now, that's going to be a major difference here. And I think if we look at that group that didn't go to college themselves, large group of people who are now shipping off their offspring to this new environment, it's a question of what are they getting into. I don't know that world.
Right.
I didn't participate in it. And,
right.
And therefore, the unknown obviously produces a great deal of fear. So, I mean, I will talk to parents along that line and who are just sort of feel totally in a chaotic state because they have no ways of getting hold of all of this. Incidentally, I think that your book is going to be very valuable for those kinds of parents.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And along those lines, we've developed something we call, very simply, a college parents glossary. Now, it's not entirely directed at parents who themselves have not had college education. but it's more directed to them than to other parents who had a chance to go to college or graduate school or professional school.
Why don't you just pick out a couple of those terms that you think parents ought to know?
Okay, I've got one with me, and let me just read through a couple, and then I'll read through our definition. The academic calendar, accreditation, advanced registration. These are phrases.
We're obviously on the A's.
We're on the A's. Let me try you on this one. Bursar's office, catalog, cooperative education. These let me read our definition for that. A plan by which a student alternates periods of classroom study with full-time employment in a field related to his or her studies. It usually results in a reduced cost for education, but sometimes an extra year or so of study is required.
Now, that's very practical for someone to know. You know, it's like any other world you enter, it's got its own terminology. It's got its language.
Exactly.
And it is not all that difficult to master the major terms that are being thrown around, and that would help parents a great deal to converse with their students. I presume one of the things we want to facilitate here is really dialogue between parents and their offspring who are off to school, and if we have a common vocabulary, that certainly helps. I would probably think in terms, if I was advising parents, probably not to get real worried about that. In fact, one of the keys I would think is like if there are words or categories that your sons or daughters use, that it's a great talking point. Like you don't have to know all of this stuff.
Exactly.
You've got your own experience. You know a lot about the world. Don't lose confidence in yourself and in your own experience, and you'll pick up the vocabulary. If your offspring start talking about them, you can ask them, well, what do you mean by this particular office or program?
I think what you're saying, it depends upon it being a relatively healthy and what is sometimes referred to as an energized family. And in our book, we draw some distinctions. They're very general ones because the research surprisingly is limited on college families. Families of preschool and elementary students we know a great deal about, but the research on families of college students is very limited. Nonetheless, the theorists have given us sort of a very general picture of healthy families which can be contrasted with unhealthy. And what you were talking about has to do with communication. And healthy families, maybe I could just comment a little bit on some of the general characteristics.
Why don't you throw out a characteristic while we both comment on it and see what we come up with.
The members of a healthy family enjoyed varied and frequent family interactions and communications. And I think that's what you're talking about. Even if the parents have never heard of a college glossary, they can sit and talk and ask questions and relate, and there's a kind of open, free discussion.
We're going to presume that when they ship their sons or daughters off now, if they have that kind of family set up, that they will be able to talk about their fears that they have for them. We'll hope that it's a situation where their sons or daughters can say what they're feeling and their hopes and anxieties connected with it, and that there's a sort of mutual trust build up that would allow this easy communication. I often think that with a lot of the problem areas of life that we don't have any pat formulas for people, but what we end up is sort of looking for attitudes, healthy outlooks on things, large perspectives, and in this case it would seem that mutual trust and general communication would be important. I know from my own experience, I'd be sitting there talking to a lot of parents saying, hey, ever since my kid became a sophomore in high school, we haven't had a serious talk,
Right.
Or she never tells me what she's thinking. She doesn't, we had it fine before. We were getting along great, but now I don't have the foggiest notion what's in her head.
And of course that can happen in healthy and energized families too. It doesn't mean that this frequent and varied communication pattern exists all the time. There are periods in which parent or child can
right. And late
moody.
Adolescent is going to be one of those.
Right. But a healthy family can adapt and change to changes in roles of family members. As a mother changes from a homemaker to somebody working outside the home, as the father changes jobs, or as a child goes off to college, that the healthy family can adapt to this, and any specific change in the role of any given family member can sort of get incorporated into the whole. And the autonomy and the freedom and the independence of each member is encouraged and recognized, rather than sort of holding on to somebody in a strangling kind of way and minimizing their independence.
So one of your key words there is adaptability.
Good.
And what's going to happen here is that the parents are going to have to show a lot of this, because they've got a new situation, don't they? I mean, just think of the situation where they ship the offspring off and they have all this freedom. They live in this residence hall. They come in when they want. They have all of this easy freedom going on, and suddenly they're back home in the summertime and expected to follow certain rules of the house. I mean, how often do you hear of that kind of problem? I mean, it is built in. How are you going to get around it? They've been able to decorate their room the way they want, or if they want to go out and party for a night, they don't have to account to anybody, and now suddenly they're back in a home environment where the mother says, well, where are you going tonight? And how long are you going to be out? And when are you going to get back? And so on. And here this adaptability you're talking about is really tested, it seems to me, in that kind of situation.
Right, it's tested there. It's also tested in a little different way with the student who is a commuter, who lives at home, who has never left, who stays in the same room, but who, while living at home, starts off going to the university. And some of the same things happen in terms of personality and motivational change and changes in friendship patterns. Maybe leaving high school friends, going to some new friends, change in dress, hairstyle, long hair and occasional earring you still see on some of the guys, and girls are changing their hair and hairstyle and clothing all the time, and parents don't like it, and you virtually see a kid change before your eyes. A little bit different kind of adjustment, where it may be even more difficult for both the parent and the kid than for somebody who's been away and comes back. Although that's tricky and very requires somebody to be adaptable also. And so
what if we're going to advise parents in this area? We're going to tell them the world goes on, people change,
yes.
That we have to expect that, to try to stay with your first point of good communication.
And we tell them just to keep in mind that in a very real sense, it's still their home. It's the family home, but the parents are the leaders, if you will, of the family, and it's still their home. And if somebody's going to come in late, and then arrangements should have been made for a key, for them to have a key so they didn't wake everybody up. If meal patterns change because of classes they're taking or jobs or both, that ought to be discussed a bit in advance. If there are a lot of changes in a college student's attitudes, clothes, hairstyle, dating habits, that kind of thing, that can be discussed and parents informed, and occasionally parents will have to assert their authority, whether it's a commuter student or a student coming back. It's in a sense still their home, and they're the head of the family in the home.
So it puts a lot of responsibility on the student, doesn't it, too, to make sure that they're willing to communicate and bring out what the problem areas are, and be able to, I suppose we'd like to see them be adaptable themselves when they come back and realize they can't live in their parents' home as they live in the residence hall, for example.
This all gets very much more difficult in families that are, for lack of a better term, I'll say, are kind of unhealthy. Rigid families where each person has a very specific and a very rigid role, and in those there's usually one person who takes the brunt of responsibility for things and often the blame when things go wrong. In families like this, there is seldom an easy and free way to solve problems or to communicate. There just seems to be an inability for them to share or to focus on common interests or common activities. And in fact, you see in some families like this that the conflict between the parents, between the mother and the father, can kind of suck the children into it and almost try and force them to take sides. Then there are also often long-standing problems in these families involving drugs, alcohol, gambling, sex, other kind of compulsive behaviors of the parents that are very upsetting and unsettling to the children, and again, kind of almost like a magnet, try and draw you either into siding with the mother or the father, or feeling like you're stuck in between. And in families like that, whether a student is going to be a commuter and attend our university, or leave Toledo, for example, and go away to school, whenever they return, there's a very conflictual and uncomfortable atmosphere they come back to. And so the solving of this new problem of how the student adapts and how the parent adapts to the changed role becomes all the more difficult. Parents like this and families like this often really can't adapt very well to a child going to college, as they can't adapt to any very large change in the role of a given member.
One thing I've seen, Norm, is sometimes students, when they do go to school, see other patterns of family life. Their friends tell them how it is in their home. They learn that maybe you don't have to fight like they did, that there's opportunities for communication. And I run into a certain number of students who feel sort of an obligation or responsibility to their families. I mean, they become missionaries in a sense. They want to go back into their family setting and maybe do it a little bit better, or improve the relationship with their parents. I admire those students because, I mean, they're not coming from a great position of strength and nourishment, but they're coming from a more enlightened view that they have learned, and they're saying, okay, I'll have to get my courage going here and try to sit down with my folks and see if I can't work out something a little bit better here. And I think they can be a force for good in this. I think if they came at it with a self-righteous attitude, they're probably going to fail, and that would be out of bounds. But on the other hand, to say, hey, couldn't we talk a little bit better, or do we have to be so rigid in this family because, some of the kids I met, they have a different relationship with their parents. And I've learned in my psych class that it's good to talk about feelings, and repressed anger is not good, and we have to find a way to deal with that. Now, that's going to take a lot of prudence on the part of young people, but I've at least seen some who have done a fairly good job of that, and it provokes a lot of respect and admiration in me. I know that.
I think that's a good point. There are many students who can come back into the home, and in some ways are more mature than their parents, and can be a very strong force for good, for resolving conflict, for opening people up, and they learn some of these skills almost naturally in the college environment, where there tend to be late-night bull sessions and a lot of sharing of ideas and activities and feelings. That can work best, I think, in families where there's a kind of a straightforwardness and an integrity about the communications, and where the problems are laid out in a sort of straightforward way, and where the family doesn't double bind, as the psychologists say, the student. The most difficult families we encounter
are... You want
to
say more about the double bind?
I will. I knew that would intrigue you for a moment. But those are families where they give contradictory messages to the student. Families that really confuse the student, and where even if the student wanted to come back and be kind of helpful and improve communication, it'd be very difficult. In our book, we have a little section we call games that families play. It's sort of a takeoff on a book a couple of decades ago by Eric Byrne, which he called games people play.
Yeah,
and we have a small section here. Our book is not essentially about pathological or disturbed families, but we have a little section just to illustrate quickly the kind of confusing messages and contradictoriness that families can have, and the difficulty of being a child in it. One of them is a game we call Don't You Love Us? To illustrate it, we have a student who we called Frank. It's not. We just changed the names of these people to guard their to protect their confidentiality. Frank's father was an abusive alcoholic whose family covered up for his frequent drunkenness and occasional violence by trying to pretend nothing was wrong. It's a pattern you see, frankly, quite often with alcohol and abuse. The whole family covers up. When Frank went away to college, he heaved a sigh of relief, and he did very little to maintain contact with his family, but he found college life was not that appealing, and it seemed shallow and empty to him. He didn't make friends and had difficulty concentrating. Every now and then his father would call him up, drunk, he'd been on a binge, and he babbled something to Frank about having deserted the family. Alternatively, his mother would write him a kind of a tight, happy letter about all the daily events, never mentioning his father's problems, but sort of whining to Frank about how he didn't really care about the family anymore, never wrote or called, and when was he coming home to visit. So he ends up being kind of unsettled by calls from his father, worried, calls him drunk. On the other hand, his mother wrote him letters saying everything's great, denied and didn't really deal at all with the father's problems, and only instilled a different kind of guilt in him, like saying, how come you don't call or write or spend time with us?
Is this part of this double bind we're trying to get at here?
Where the family, in a sense, says, we love you, we want you, we need you, but on the other hand, they may be saying, things are horrible, but they're really okay. We're really covering up for some terrible problems here, but don't pay any attention, everything's okay.
Isn't it remarkable how many more people we seem to run into these days? They call them the adult children of alcoholics. I mean, we had books by that title, and so on, and
groups,
just to pick up
on that theme.
Yeah, and it just seems like the pattern, the syndrome is so clear that these people the students that are involved in those situations are unable to trust their own experience. They're constantly worried about whether they have the approval of authority figures or not. Life seems rather untrustworthy to them, and in life it just isn't steady. It doesn't have a solidity about it, and it makes it hard for them to function. And certainly, you can begin to see how much difficulty they're going to have in adapting in the college situation. Although I must say, I think, again, some of them thrive on it. Some of them get to feel that, well, this is a good place to be, and, I'm away from all of those difficulties. I know students who don't like to go back to their families for that reason. They'd
Right.
rather go off in the summer or someplace else, and vacations they just bop in briefly because it's too traumatic. They felt liberated in the college atmosphere, and they don't want to go back to that restrictive environment. There's some stability in their relationships at the university that they don't find in their home, and I can't blame them for not wanting to go back there.
I think most of us as parents are probably doing the best we can, but we all err in one direction or another, or have some excess, I guess you could say. And in the book, we allude to some sort of categories or sort of a typology of parents who seem to have some negative effects on their kids. Most of the book really is to empower parents, to help strengthen them, inform them about college life, give them some tips about how to relate to kids during late adolescence and early adulthood, and it's not easy. In fact, a friend of mine recently said you ought to call it that we should call it a prayer book, since students are so hard to contend with during late high school and college.
That's
we
good.
should call
I like
prayer.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I thought you might.
Yes.
And we have some other categories of parents, and maybe there's a little bit of each of us in some of these. We have
That's one thing, a general statement about the typologies, isn't it? We probably, people reading your book or listening to conversation about it are not going to say, well, yeah, we're an unhealthy family,
Right.
and you got these other healthy families. What happens is that all families and all individuals are a mix of these various typologies you're talking about, and the value of them is they focus our attention on potential problem areas and then maybe ways of improving it in one way or another. So if one family, just to go back, if they said, well, we don't communicate well, that's true, we don't talk about feelings, well, then they got a clue. Like, if we're going to make this college experience successful, then I'm going to have to ask, how did it go? I'm going to have to sit and listen to what roommates went through. I'm going to have to try to understand that different world so that we can make it better as a family in dealing with it.
Right. I'm glad you said that, because our typology has a kind of a negative sound to it, but really we offer it in the spirit of trying to kind of inform ourselves. One part of it is called the parent who's the guilt tripper, and it's sort of the out of sight, out of mind, maybe the lot of some students whose parents seem to forget they exist when they leave town for college. In the case of Frank, that I mentioned a moment ago, he often wouldn't hear from his parents weeks at a time. And then in response to a letter or a phone call from their kids, these families will, in Frank's case, his mother sent him letters and denied problems, but other more obvious guilt-tripping families simply flood the student with gifts, with money, with visits to expensive restaurants, and in ways, any way they can, sort of shower him with all kinds of things, at the same time acknowledging he hasn't talked to them or called them for weeks.
Do you think
the student ends up feeling horrible about it, feeling even more guilty than otherwise, and the problem usually doesn't get resolved this way, and simply saying sort of straightforwardly, let's sit down and work out some sort of a plan so we know what to expect as parents, when you might call, when you might write, how we might communicate, and we as parents will let you know something about what to expect by way of letters or gifts, or and hopefully they can match it up. But
that's good. So we would want them to talk about that a little bit. I wonder how many parents fall into that trap these days of being over-solicitous about their offspring. I'm thinking that, you put it in terms of lavish gifts and restaurants and so on, and there'd be a certain minority of people financially able to do that, I suppose. But I wonder if maybe there isn't some sort of an over-concern that parents sometimes manifest, not willing to let go of their sons or daughters, or recognizing they're becoming more mature and that they're freer people, and I have to allow for that. And then I think a lot of times the students have to work hard for things or have to take initiative or even work while they're going to school. Often I think they appreciate it more and so on. So I think one thing we'd have to tell parents, I think, is don't get carried away with thinking you got to do everything for them.
I'm certainly guilty as charged on this one. I'm an over-solicitous parent of our son who's a sophomore at Ohio State. We were there for Parents' Weekend about a month ago, and I was meeting a lot of the students in his fraternity, and the guy who handles the mail said to me, "Oh, you're Roger's dad," because he says, "You're the one that sends the packages and the letters."
Yes, yeah.
My son, on the other hand, said to me, "Gosh, Dad, you really don't need to write this much or send 4 pounds of pistachios just because you know I like them." And it's and I said, "You're right. I kind of go a little overboard. I think I'm concerned. I'm interested. And I'll cool it," and I have.
Well,
and then of course he says to me, "How come I never hear from you?"
Yeah,
right.
But I like the way you described that personally, and also the solution that comes out is because what you ended up using is a bit of communications at a very informal level that says, "Hey, Dad, back off a bit," and you were able to listen to that and adjust behavior and so on, which I think is a very common sense kind of example of what you've been calling for here is how we're going to adjudicate these problems and get more of a cooperative solution going.
Do you want to hear some more of these?
Yes, why don't you try
types?
one more?
Okay.
Yeah.
Here's one that I think fits so many of us, whether it's more or less.
I think you're going to have to tell the story slowly. Why don't you just make your point without the story?
This one is called the Worrier. And it's the parent who looks over every detail of the student's life during high school. He has a terrible time letting go, writes asking the son or daughter about their diet, their laundry, their sleeping habits, has to know every little detail, and shows their anxiety and concern that way. Usually just makes the student more worried, more doubting, and more unsure of themselves.
It's a lot of that detail thing that gets in the way there,
we call that parent the Worrier.
The Worrier, yes. And we've no doubt got a lot of those kind of parents
You hardly
around.
meet one today who isn't.
who isn't that. And you know what the parents are going to say is, you have to worry today because the culture's different, because you got all these other problems, and it's more complex than when I went to school, or I never went to college and my life was simpler and so on. Well, Norm, we have run out of time to talk about this, and I realize you have a long book and many more things to say, but I think what we're trying to look at is the family situation. You made the point well at the beginning. Going to college is a family matter, and if we're going to make it work better, I think the family's going to have to learn to communicate, to have the proper trust for one another, and to, in a sense, let go of their offspring as they go off to college.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Norman Gadan, who is the head of the Counseling Center at the University of Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was College and the Family, dealing with home life. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.